Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you our tier list for 10.2 for Season 3. And before you click away to the end, I do want to emphasize that I think that all healers in this incoming season are far better balanced than they were last season for two different reasons. One of which is the balance of healers is often dependent upon how one healer is in relation to the other, but also it's about the entire group composition and how well that healer can fit in with the rest of the team that you have, depending on the tanks, depending on the DPS. And the better balance that tanks and DPS are, then the more flexible your healer slot can be as a result. Season 1 of Dragonflight had a lot of healer variety because the tank and DPS variety was also good. I believe most of Exodia is not going to be fitting together in the same exact way, but I do believe that Aug Evoker and Mage are still going to be standing from the really high value slots in the highest key levels. And when it comes to the dungeon pool, that also is going to be dictating who you're bringing. For Dispels, the new season for 10.2 has minimal amounts of curse dispels, but if you're bringing Mage, you kind of have that covered. They're nice to be able to have some curse dispels here and there, but they are far from mandatory. Poisons have some mandatory areas in Darkheart Thicket with the Poisoner enemies, as well as Everbloom with some of the tank busters and some of the stinger mobs that are going around in that instance. Diseases are really important in Darkheart Thicket at the very end if you're doing the trash pack in the tunnel, and in Waycrest Manor, where just about every other mob is tossing out diseases at you. It also is pretty helpful in Throne and Ataldazar, making it so that having one of those in your group in the regular format and having a poison spell regularly is going to be really important. Mass Dispel is far from mandatory in the incoming season. There's some nice benefits to have it, of course, but it's nowhere near like it was in Season 2, where having it was mandatory in a few different areas, so keep that in mind. Season 1 of Dragonflight featured crazy AoE damage, but Season 2 was a bit more spot healing and some still heavy pressure and heavy burst output that was going on. In Season 3, there's very difficult mechanics that you have to deal with, and there's a very large mix of single target and AoE output required. Some boss fights are even requiring you to prio target certain players while healing the AoE damage that's going out. There's a lot of pressure going out onto your party in these dungeons, and the burst damage is still quite high, benefiting healers that bring both single target output, have damage reduction for their team, and good survivability and good healing on the move. And lastly, utility, Mind Soothe. While it's helpful, it is not mandatory. Rogue, if there is possibilities for it to make a comeback, can kind of operate in a very similar format because there's not any of those mobs like the dragons that you would see in Halls of Infusion that you needed to have Mind Soothe to be able to sort of skip. There are some value to root removals, whether you're in Darkheart Thicket or in Everbloom. Being able to bypass certain mechanics like Oakheart to be able to nullify the root mechanics on those bosses are pretty helpful, but again, far from mandatory. And finally, the scaling of dungeons is very awkward on PTR at the moment, where you're able to kill mobs really easily. You can kind of just round up and alternate between AoE stops and then kill the trash pack before it kills you. But this is off of Season 2 scaling, and they always update the scaling, and that matters a lot because the more health these mobs have, the less viable doing those kind of crazy, insane pulls are to be able to progress through a dungeon. And so while you may see us railroad some 25s with Fortified on the Keystone, or you might see some streamers like mine at twitch.tv/AutomaticJak taking care of business and just running over these dungeons even though we have 20 or 30 deaths because the damage is so high. That's not going to be reality. It's just a public test realm, so also be mindful of that. Now on to the list. Of course, topping us off, we have God Mode with Holy Paladin. I think that this should be no surprise, and the rest of the tier list is going to be more from the most competitive area possible. God Mode, of course, Holy Paladin being able to fit most groups with the perfect dispel profile of poisons and diseases, bringing immunities, damage reduction. I'm sure a lot of you who played in Season 2 know the rest. The spec, while it does not deal great amounts of damage, it's kind of average at best. The output, especially around its cooldowns, is particularly strong, and it continues to be able to do the things that it's successful at going into Season 3. That being said, bringing a melee interrupt and bringing a battle res are two really valuable pieces of utility for an entire M+ group, when it looks like Augmentation Evoker and Mage still seem to be operating in some really high value slots as you're going into high keys. And so Paladin's able to squeeze in there, bringing the low interrupt cooldown, immunities, damage reduction, their own survivability to the team to sort of make up for some other weak spots or to be able to further enhance some of the strengths of the group around it. The other bases that we have for our tier list are fitting most groups, being very flexible, especially when tank and DPS variety is also going to be strong. Some healers, I think you're going to need specific comps to be able to really make them shine. And finally, some I think are going to struggle more than others at a higher keystone level, and some of their utility becomes a little bit redundant based off of what's already good right now. In our slot for fits most groups, there's actually really good competition here, and I don't think any of the 4 specs in here are way ahead of others. Mistweaver Monk, I think, is going to start us off, and this might be an incredibly hot take, but their survivability has only improved going into Season 3, and I believe their strength and how they're able to weave between different cooldowns, whether it's going to be high Shayloon stacks, their 1-minute cooldown on their Celestial, or just cranking high output very rapidly. I think Monk, as they continue to get Clouded Focus nerfs, but then we're receiving Invigorating Mists and Vivify buffs, only seeks to be able to help the spec in a 5-man environment, improving their spot healing and their AoE healing at the same time, while also having multiple survivability buffs to expel harm, being an incredibly meaty self-heal, while also contributing damage, and being able to have bounce back, receiving strong buffs, improving their survivability, improving their passive damage reduction, while their active defensive spells in Diffuse Magic and Dampen Harm being quite strong to be able to handle some of the crazy amounts of burst damage that these dungeons are going to be bringing. Having the melee kick on hand and just being able to have multiple AoE stops in the mass stun and in Ring of Peace is only going to help the spec when it comes into a higher key level. And while it deals respectable damage, it's not some of the highest damage that you will see. I think it does a very good amount of damage, and I really believe that Mistweaver could be excelling in this incoming season. Well, that was a hot take. Disc Priest should not be. This spec, while it lacks a kick, this is where, again, it fits most groups, is that it'll really shine a lot with specs like Vengeance Demon Hunter and Prot Paladin, who are able to bring a lot of AoE stops on their own. While Disc lacks a kick, they do bring incredible amounts of damage, damage reduction, and a decent amount of absorbs to be able to get you over the hump. They also are bringing your Mind Soothe, which I mentioned earlier, is not mandatory by any means, but it does give you a little bit of flexibility in optimizing your pulls by skipping around some less necessary trash mobs, or even just having an easier time for your tank to be able to set up certain pulls. Being able to just Mind Soothe and walk past certain mobs, pull them later, or ignore them entirely, gives you a lot of extra options for how you'd like to route through the dungeon, and only seeks to make the rest of the team better as a result. In addition, since Shadow Priest is in a position where it's not looking super strong going into the next tier, of course tuning can change that, but having a spec that's able to PI the Mage, if Mage is going to be a likely mainstay from Season 2 to Season 3, that's only going to help Disc, because they're already bringing tremendous amounts of damage on their own, and even more so when they're buffing somebody else. So Disc, I think, is going to be fitting most groups, and I think it is a contender for one of the best healers out there. If not for Augmentation of Ogre, Preservation might actually be one of the best healers for Season 3 M+. Bringing Cauterizing Flame is fantastic, and having a second of them continues to be absolutely excellent. There's a crazy amount of bleeds going out into these dungeons, and while some of them are kind of like Grievous effects that if you top them off, you're then able to remove the effect entirely, you can also just cauterize them and don't have to worry about cranking up that health pool instantly. The spec deals with phenomenal amounts of damage in Season 3. The utility of having Zephyr, Omni Dispel, Bleed Removal, they are bringing the Bloodlust, they have the Poison Dispel by default. The spec's doing great damage, great healing all of the time, makes Preservation incredibly strong. There's a little bit of lesser value, you could say, but it's a very niche thing of having Aug and Preservation in the group, of like losing buffs. For example, not having a Priest, but having a Preservation of Ochre instead means you're missing out on like a little bit of stamina buff. It's a very little min-maxy type of thing, but again, that's what this list is for. If you play Preservation of Ochre, you're going to have a phenomenal time in Season 3. Next up on our list to round out fitting most groups is Resto Druid. And while it's painful to go after and interrupt to the point that in my consultation with Resto Druid players, they were saying don't even think about it, Resto still does bring a lot to the table, including the battle res, including a good poison dispel, a respectable amount of damage, and they also have phenomenal output for a lot of the encounters that you're going to be facing up against. Druid historically has just been great at being able to stack their hots and improve their output by just funneling all of their hots to take advantage of their mastery and dump healing into the targets that need it the most. And I think Resto Druid, again, not to be able to like pick and choose between the 4 that are in this slot. I think they're in very close competition with Mistweaver, Disc, and Preservation of Ochre for all of the different strengths that they bring, because they actually do bring slightly different strengths to the table, but the way that they can churn out high output, all 4 of them, and you can even include 5 with Holy Paladin, they all have the capability of churning out really high output, especially when they're forced into positions to be able to move. That's historically been one of Druid's really big niches, and you're going to need a lot of it going into next tier, whether it's dropping tons of single target output into one person while a dispel goes off and then working to top off the rest of the group from the damage. The tier fight and the time waste encounter in Dawn of the Infinite both come to mind, and those are amazing areas where Druid is going to be able to excel. One of the biggest challenges that we faced at the start of Season 2 was actually about players being able to survive the incoming damage. It's something that's been carried over from Shadowlands, where everybody obsesses over healer damage as like the most important thing. But really, last season of Dragonflight, it was all about being able to survive and be able to actually push into the higher levels and make sure the entirety of your group is going to be able to live. And especially as people are learning these encounters, and especially because the punishment for failing some of the many mechanics that are in these Season 3 dungeons is just taking more damage, Resto Druid is very well suited to be able to make up for those mistakes from those players and be able to help heal your way through all of the pressure that they're facing. For our next tier, when needing specific comps, this healer is Holy Priest, as they have good strengths, and I feel like they're in a better position than where they were at in Season 2. Getting the new tier set bonus to allow you to have additional holy words, often holy word serenity, really does a great job in helping you top off and sort of bounce back from incoming damage. The spec really struggles with mobile healing, especially when you need to heal everybody all at once, and they're spread, and you're moving. The Everbloom encounter, the mage boss, the 3rd boss in that instance, kind of comes to mind, as does the end of Dawn of the Infinite, the 2nd wing, when you're fighting up against Murozond. Those fights are really challenging to be able to heal everybody when they're spread and when there's just kind of chaos going on. That's usually not been one of Holy Priest's strengths. Bringing Symbol to the table is pretty nice. As we mentioned with Disc, Mind Sooth has a number of good benefits. The Disease Dispel is very important in dungeons like Warcraft Manor. It's just that the spec is going to be struggling a little bit more and possibly leaning on the utility of another composition to be able to fill in some of the holes. While they're bringing the Disease Dispel, having the Augvoker around for the poisons helps a lot, for example. Being able to have like the Mage's Mass Barrier, always going to be helping a lot. It's just that the spec, when it comes to that mobile healing in a number of different dungeons, is going to struggle more compared to those other healers, and particularly when you need to like spread AoE heal, that's where the spec really struggles, because you're just trying to drop as many serenities as you kind of can, as quickly as you possibly can, to be able to get your way out of it. The new tier set helps a lot with this problem, but it's kind of just been a long-term problem for the spec that hasn't really had much of a solution. And finally, to round out our list is Resto Shaman. While I'm sure there's plenty of high keys that you're able to get done with the spec, you really are going to be leaning on your group much more so than others for really a variety of reasons. For one, the utility that you do bring to the table is sort of made redundant by Augmentation of Ochre, that of bringing Bloodlust. Doesn't matter that much if Aug or Mage are both bringing it to the table. The Curse Dispel is not particularly relevant in a lot of dungeons. It's a small side advantage at best in a number of them. Even areas like Warcraft Manor that feature a Curse Dispel often have curses going off at the same time as magical effects that you need to dispel. The Poison Dispelling Totem is pretty good in a number of dungeons, like in Everbloom, but sometimes you also need a sustained amount of Poison Dispels. If you're pulling multiple Stingers or going into multiple pulls of Stingers, yeah, being able to remove 2 or 3 over an 8-9 second period is great, but then they're gonna keep on stacking and you need to sustain more of those dispels. And that's where the spec is starting to lean more on others. And like I mentioned with Holy Priest before, mobile healing can absolutely be quite a problem, especially when you need to heal a variety of targets. While Shaman's cooldowns were nerfed going into 10.2, they're still fairly strong, but it's very noticeable not having that sort of bounce back potential when you do have a large cloudburst that you've been investing in very heavily, and you're just seeing health bars kind of barely moving as a result, which feels really, really poor. Leaning on Chain Heal can be effective, especially since it was buffed a few different times in 10.2, but it's also still very costly in dungeons, and that's going to be a major point of struggle that I found much more so than other healers. Shaman felt like it actually had to sit down and drink a lot more than the other ones that I was playing, and that also only really serves to be more of a detriment for the spec. Your way to sort of dig your way out of problems is burning your mana bar down than a lot of other healers have to, especially in the case of like Mistweaver having their new mana tea allows them to pool up mana much better than others, while Shaman doesn't really have that potential on hand. They've received probably some of the heaviest nerfs out of all the healers going into 10.2, and I think it's only going to continue to struggle as their damage has been on the mediocre side, their healing is less flexible, and their utility is often made less valuable as a result of the different group compositions. Having the AoE stops, having a great kick are also very helpful, and the spec will absolutely be benefited by having good tank variety and good DPS variety, but if there was ever a spec I think needs some considerable attention given to it for improving its performance in a 5-man environment, I think it would be Shaman. Now, I'm pretty sure I have a couple hot takes in here, so let me know what you guys think about this one. And if you're enjoying the tier list, be sure to subscribe. Keep in mind, a lot of M+ at the highest levels possible is getting into the groups, working and progressing together as a team to learn the dungeons and what everybody's jobs are. If you push through it, you absolutely can succeed. I hope you guys enjoy Season 2. Be sure to check out more of our content here on YouTube or on Twitch, and I'll see y'all next time.